In this video, we're going to take a look at my biggest creative failure and hopefully help you avoid doing something similar yourself. Hi, I'm Adam Bennett. This is the Video Shop. I see a lot of successful outcomes out there in motion design land. People sharing work they're happy with, but you don't hear as much about failing. Essentially, this video will be Adam trying to rip off ordinary folk and failed abysmally, but maybe from that child wreckage we can pick out some clues as to what went wrong. Before we start, I need to be clear that I'm talking about creative failure. I could dedicate a whole YouTube channel to my professional failures, but I'm not sure what appetite there is for weekly videos of a grown man sobbing and writing letters of apology. We're going to take a look at this. It's an explained video that I made back in 2020.
You're advertising it on Facebook, and the downloads are rolling in. So why aren't you rolling in money? Most users will never pay in apps. What if you could zoom in on the users that actually do?
And while it might not be the worst thing that happened that year,
Imagine.
I can't look at it without wincing. But if I can walk you through what I think went wrong, maybe something positive can come out of it. The second thing I want to make crystal clear is that everything I'm picking on in this animation is 100% down to me. There's really good audio work here done by a talented friend of mine. The VO and other elements were properly mixed, and it had a decent budget. Not exactly the budget of the work I was aspiring to, but we'll get to that. I'm not shitting on the end result. As an explainer video, you could argue that it works, but I'm talking about the difference between what was in my head and what I exported out of After Effects. What should we prioritise? Producing amazing creative work or pleasing the client? Well, the answer is both, of course, and it really shouldn't be a binary choice. In this case, the client did sign it off and was happy, so why wasn't I? And does that even matter? Okay, let's get started. This is the pitch deck for the animation. I personally hate doing these. I hate it! I'm not a good designer. Just give me the frames and let me animate them. I don't mind doing a mood board for my own personal work, but as soon as the pressure of selling the client your idea is introduced, I break out in a cold sweat. And that's the first issue here. What did I provide as reference? Amazing work, far beyond my capability as a motion designer. Recognise any of these? I leaned very hard on the work of Ordinary Folk and Volko. Ordinary Folk are one of my favourite studios. Their work is glorious, and I'm not worthy to touch the hems on their garments. But for some reason I forgot or ignored this, and thought, hey, what this client really needs is an Ordinary Folk style explainer animation done entirely by me. But most of the work you admire isn't done by one person. Look at the credits page of this project, for example. It's easy to forget this when you're just seeing the finished projects in your feed. Whenever I'm lucky enough to get a project which has creative scope and freedom, I get wildly excited at all the amazing innovative possibilities. Then as the project progresses, I often get increasingly frustrated with how far short the results are from my expectations. This is an uncommon feeling in creative industries. Artists often painted over their canvases, and when Woody Allen finished making Annie Hall, he was so bitterly disappointed with the film that he offered to buy the negative from the producers so he could destroy it. I can relate to how he felt. You want the work to be amazing, and if things just aren't clicking, or you realise you've overstretched yourself, all you can think about is what the work isn't. But then it becomes all about you. The second mistake I made was making this project about my own creative flex, and not what the brief needed. Focus on the brief, not your creative goals. There's a danger in trying to make a certain approach fit, no matter what. With this project, the script was already written, so I didn't have to do that part at least. It was my job to translate that script into animation. I should have had an open mind about what concept would be the best way of bringing that script to life on screen, not be hell-bent on using this as an opportunity to add a certain animation style to my showreel. Take the script, do a mind map, let the concept emerge organically that way. Then if the concept is strong, it should be able to endure client amends, because the core idea is well thought out and transcends aesthetics. Yes, I said transcends aesthetics. I'd argue that if you've been rigorous in finding the best creative solution, there's a much better chance that there'll be minimal client amends, or at the very least they won't come because the foundations for your animation are weak.
Great, you've built your app. Great, you've built your app. Great, you've built your app. Great.
If all you're doing is chasing a look or trend, or worse, in my case, copying a studio's particular style, then your idea is a house of cards which is liable to topple over with the smallest gust of breeze.
Is this some fucking joke?
For the purposes of this crappy analogy, gust of breeze equals the client questioning why you've done things a certain way.
Why?
Why?
And all you can offer is, because I wanted to make a cool animation with rolling 2.5D balls. I'm not saying don't aspire to do great work, just be aware of the limitations when you start a project and work accordingly. I'm also not saying that you shouldn't push or stretch yourself creatively. In the past I've taken on projects where I knew I could do say 95% of what I promised, and guessed that I'd be able to work out the other 5% on the job, or if I was really struggling, bring in someone else to help. But the struggle with this was the whole thing, just failing outright to achieve the same Milan as a creative studio at the top of their game.
You're advertising it on Facebook, and the downloads are rolling in. So why aren't you rolling in money? So why aren't you rolling in money? So why aren't you rolling in money? So why aren't you rolling in money?
Work to the budget. In this case the budget was okay, but definitely not what ordinary folk would have had for this. I should be experienced enough to have realised this and pitched something more in line with their budget. For example, the video I did for the client previously was a much more simple 2D style, and there was already a design language for some of the terms I struggled to visualise in this animation, such as paying users or payers. Here they're represented by icons with a crown, and that's consistent in the whole animation. The client wanted the same kind of consistency in this animation, but the idea was nowhere near as clear, and that's entirely my fault. Know what you can and can't do. In this case, definitely what I couldn't do, both as a designer and an animator, and a producer. More on that shortly. The client's previous video was storyboarded by someone else, and it's got far more clarity. I should have got someone else to storyboard and star frame this one. Instead, I ignored my weaknesses and tried to do it all myself. I rushed the storyboard process because I was so keen to get to the animation. I put in frames that I knew that I didn't want, just to get the concept signed off, and thought, oh, it's okay, I'll figure that out later when I'm animating it. Terrible idea. It's a common adage that it's possible to make a bad film from a good script, but you can't make a good film from a bad script. The script is everything. You can't expect the client to see beyond a mediocre storyboard, or stick to it when they finally get to see it animated.
I mean, I feel insulted just having seen it.
So I ended up spending far longer on this animation than I should have done. Again, my fault. The client was understandably questioning what I'd sent them, so I had to redo several scenes because they lacked clarity, or were just rubbish. I'll fix that. This is one area where a good producer will step in. A good producer not only acts as a buffer between the creative and the client, but they can negotiate tricky scenarios where revisions are asked for which test the budget. I essentially produced this myself, so the constant revisions were again my fault. I can't blame the client because the concept was so poor to begin with. It's perfectly understandable that the client will want to scrutinise what isn't working and want things amended accordingly. So in the end, with all this said and done, did the final animation work? Well, to answer that, I'd have needed to ask the client whether it did what they wanted it to do, presumably in this case translating into leads or sales. That would have meant following up on the project after it was signed off and paid for, showing an interest in the project beyond my own creative ambition and getting paid. Did I do that? Of course I fucking didn't. I was too busy making excuses why this one didn't work out and focusing on the next one, which definitely will work out better.
It's gonna be amazing!
Who are you looking at?
If this animation had been a successful sales tool for the client, then it can't be considered a failure, at least not financially. It wouldn't have mattered how cack-handed my approach was. Following up on marketing work like this is often overlooked by motion designers, because we can be so focused on the creativity. I've done work like events graphics and edits, where you know exactly how well it performs, because if you're lucky enough to be at the event, you can see whether it's grabbing the audience's attention. But work which a client will then take and slot into a sales campaign often just disappears into the ether, and you forget about it and move on. So with this, since I didn't bother to follow up with the client after the invoice was paid, I can only judge it creatively. Going back to that Annie Hall example, I don't know what was in Woody Allen's head when he made Anedonia. That's what it was called during production, factoid fans. I can only judge the end result, which is widely regarded to be a classic. If you look at this animation, there are elements which work on a technical level. Match cuts, animation timing in places which aren't completely egregious, but it doesn't have anywhere near the clarity and elegance of the work I was aspiring to. I've collaborated in the past, and the work has always ended up being better than if I had the time to do it all myself. Good collaborations are often more than the sum of their parts. So if I had the chance to do this over again, what would I do? I'd allow more time for the concepts. I'd get a good designer to create the storyboard frames. If 3D is needed, or there are parts of the animation that I think need a particular technique or flourish beyond my abilities, I'll get someone else to help. And finally, I'll check in with the client after the animation is delivered to see how it performed. Having an awareness of great work is one thing, but don't rip it off. Look at it, study it, find out what the agency's or designer's workflow is. Why did they use these particular colours or fonts or animation style? Don't just copy the end result. Find out how they got there, and if you have to copy anything, emulate the process instead. Of course, it's fine to pull reference for a pitch deck. We need the client to be able to visualise what we have in mind, but ask how much of yourself you're putting into the presentation. Can you honestly say your concept is drawing from different influences and not simply just plagiarising them? There's a lot of following trends in our industry, and that's understandable. Even if you're not aping what's already been done, you might have a client asking for a specific style because they've seen it elsewhere. But the best work is done by those who are brave enough to propose a look or approach which is bold and different.
I can't even see what's good anymore.
When I look at this now, I have to wonder if it made sense to the target audience back in 2020. Maybe they had other things on their minds. Ultimately, you have to judge work like this on how well it communicates an idea to the viewer. And sometimes as motion designers, you can find yourself wearing several hats, especially if you're working freelance direct to client. Copywriter, designer, animator, producer. We're trusted by the client to be able to juggle all of these roles and keep our focus on the brief and target audience. Earlier I asked what should we prioritise, doing amazing creative work or that the client walks away happy. I think if you're smart enough to avoid making the mistakes I did with this animation, there's less chance of that being a binary choice. talking of binary choices, remember at the start when I said I was just talking about creative failure and not professional? Well, that's dumb, isn't it? If you fail creatively on a project for a client, how can you not also, on some level, be failing professionally? Being a professional means being able to balance the things that I mentioned above. Maybe I'll talk more about that once I've got the hang of it. Thanks for watching, see you again soon.